Social media is a big part of our life these days, isn't it? All of us have some sort of influence on us because of social media, although some of us more than others. There are some great things about social media. You can see pictures of family members who live a long way away. You can be present for events, at least enjoy some of them, even though you weren't able to be there. You can chat with people on the other side of the world. And there are lots of things that we can discover about what's out there and opportunities and beautiful things to look at. But some of their things that happen to us on social media are a bit of a downside, and one of them is called FOMO, which stands for fear of missing out. On social media, we see other people's vacations and their new haircut and their brand new car and maybe their clothing or some fun thing that they're doing that we have never gotten to do. We see what they eat for lunch and where they're currently taking a selfie. And sometimes we feel as if there are just all these opportunities that everyone else is experiencing and we're missing out. And that's really not a healthy mindset for us. And really in the end, what does it care what do we care what someone else had for lunch? But it is too bad that as believers, the way we live does not create in others a feeling that they are missing out on something wonderful. Paul knew that he had something wonderful, something that others didn't have unless they had a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And Paul willingly shared what he knew and what he had with anyone who would listen, praying that they would have a desire for what he had and seek God. He was called to this task, and so are we. We are beginning the study in the book of Romans, the letter to the church in Rome, and we are looking today at chapters 1, verses 1 to 17. So you can open your Bible and follow along if you would like, please. This is a letter, and the opening of letters of that time usually kind of followed a formulaic pattern. The author usually identified themselves, identified the person or the group to whom they were writing, and then gave some sort of blessing. In books like Philippians or Ephesians, that usually took about 2 verses at the start of the letter. But Paul spends 7 verses on his greeting here in the letter to Rome, the longest greeting of any of the books that he wrote for us. He's probably spending more time on this greeting because he did not found this church, he has never visited them, and he probably only knows a very few number of people that are in there. So he's introducing himself to them and kind of trying to build a connection in order to maybe earn a hearing with them, you might say. So he begins by introducing himself, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ. Now the word servant in the original Greek, the one that we have translated into that English word servant, was actually slave. And so Paul is putting himself on the social level of the majority of the believers in the church in Rome, because 75% of the city of Rome were slaves, and the church probably represented the same kind of mix of mostly enslaved people and a few that were not. So Paul is presenting himself as one who lives under the authority of a master, who serves a master who is under control. And in this case, of course, his master is Jesus Christ. Then he says he is called to be an apostle. He is claiming the position of one who is responsible to God for the founding of the early church. He was given this position by God. It wasn't Paul's idea. He also tells them that what his specific task is. He has been set apart for the gospel. In verse 2, he points out that the gospel is not a new idea. This is the same gospel given by God through the prophets in the Old Testament. And Paul says what the gospel is about. It's about Jesus, the Son of God. The Son, in his earthly nature, is a descendant of David. He is fully human. But he is also fully divine. He is declared to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead. Now, just to be clear, this doesn't mean he became the Son of God when he rose from the dead. Rather, the resurrection demonstrated or gave evidence to his divine nature, to what he already was. It is the ultimate proof of his deity that he was able to rise from the dead. In verse 5, Paul repeats the source of his apostleship. He is obeying the call of God on his life by spreading the gospel to the Gentiles by the command of God. Paul puts this in kind of an unusual way in the middle of verse 5. We received grace and apostleship to call all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith in his name's sake. We received grace. That's kind of an unusual way to put that. How is grace a part of this call? Well, of course, one obvious answer is we need God, and out of his grace, God supplies the gifts and the abilities that we require in order for us to be able to do the work that he's called us to do. Paul was given the gifts and abilities he needed to be an apostle. But the other is that it's a huge act of God's kindness and grace to include us in his work in the first place. It might not always look like grace. It was a tough road for Paul. He was shipwrecked, beaten, imprisoned, and eventually beheaded. Doesn't sound a whole lot like grace, does it? But it is an honor to be given a task to do for God, to be included in his work, to be given work to do, to be allowed to serve him, to be called by the king. And Paul knows he is unworthy of this, and so too are we. The last part of verse 5 says that the Gentiles have been called to the obedience that comes from faith. In the original, it is literally the obedience of faith. The relationship between faith and obedience is often discussed and sometimes misunderstood. Here's the best way I've ever heard it explained. Faith, if genuine, always has obedience as an outcome. Obedience, if it's going to please God, must always be accompanied by faith. Faith is not just necessary for salvation, it's actually an essential part of all of our Christian life and service. Dr. Moo said that what marks the people of God is not an outward list of deeds, such as Israel displayed in the Old Testament, but the obedience that stems from and accompanies and displays faith. Paul then says that these believers in Rome are among those who are called to belong to Jesus. He's really claiming them as part of his ministry of obligation. They were not saved through his ministry, but they are a part of the call of God and on his life through the Gentiles, to reach the Gentiles with the gospel. In verse 7, he identifies those to whom he is writing and gives a greeting. To all who are in Rome, who are loved by God and called to be his holy people. I really love that phrase, who are loved by God. This is us too, loved by God and called to be holy. There is such a personal nature to the call of God. At the end of verse 7, finishing out his greeting section, Paul speaks a blessing, using both a traditional Jewish blessing and a Gentile one. He says, grace and peace to you. Grace, charis, was a typical Gentile blessing, and peace, shalom, a typical Jewish one. For Paul, life is about the gospel. He knows the world is full of people who do not know Jesus, people who are lost. They are missing out on the joy of knowing God through Jesus. And he is committed to sharing the gospel. That is his calling. For him, life is about the gospel. And the gospel is all about Jesus. When you think of your life, if you were to complete this sentence, my life is all about blank, what would you put in the blank? Your kids? Your job? Your house? Your body image? Getting your kids a great college education? Getting your own college education? Making a little bit more money? Being able to travel? What would it be? Now, I know you know what should go in the blank. But what does really go in the blank? What really are you living for? Is that the call of God on your life, or is it something that is your own idea? Our life as believers should be about Jesus and about the gospel. Paul continues to present himself to this church in kind of a diplomatic way. And so in verse 8, he commends them for their faith, which he says is known throughout the world. Now, this church is in the capital city of the empire. It's a city full of pagan worship, idolatry, immorality, and sin. The emperor declared himself to be the Son of God, thus setting up a religion worshiping him as well as the idols of the Roman Empire rather than the God of heaven. And in the midst of all of this, in this very difficult place, in the face of this opposition, this church is living a strong faith. Paul speaks of his committed service to God, and he says that he remembers this church in prayer constantly. His ministry and the work of God that he knows needs to be undergirded in prayer, and Paul does that. The same is true today. Ministry of any kind needs to be undergirded in prayer. One thing Paul has wanted and prayed for is an opportunity to go and visit this church, and now he thinks the time may be right for him to do so. Perhaps he wonders if they are going to feel slighted that he has never yet come to them before this. And he tells them that he wanted to, but has been prevented. But he hopes soon to visit. Now, if you remember from our intro into the book last week, he does not get to go and visit them right away. He plans to, he wants to, but again, he is prevented, at least for the moment. He will get to Jerusalem. He will be arrested in Jerusalem. And he will go to Rome, but it will be in chains. And he will be under house arrest in Rome for the next 2 years. And so he will not get to go to the church and visit. If they want to see him or talk with him, they're going to have to visit him in the place where he is in chains. God seems to have given him this desire to visit this church, and yet God doesn't allow him to actually do it, at least not right yet. But his desire to go and the plan to visit results in this letter written to them to say that he wants to come and laying out his message to the Gentiles in order to get them on board with his ministry. His God-given desire to visit them is used by God to give us this book, and it continues to have an impact on the church down through the centuries. God's goal was the letter. That's one thing we learn about God. His plans are very far-reaching. We see one little bit, but he sees way into the future. We want a face-to-face visit. He wants a letter written. We have to trust that the work he gives us is for our good and that it will reach his long-range plans, even if it doesn't go quite the way we envision. Paul tells them why he wants to visit them. He wants to impart some spiritual gift to them, he says in verse 11. Now, we're not quite sure what that is. Maybe it's some teaching he thinks they need. But he also wants to hear their stories and be encouraged. He says that in verse 12. I imagine him wanting to hear how they came to know Jesus, or what God is doing to provide for them, or how God is enabling and strengthening them as they live in this very pagan place. The story of each person matters in the church. How God teaches you, how he saved you, what he is doing to grow you, that matters. It encourages and strengthens the hearts of those who hear. So share what God teaches you. Maybe make a goal to share this week with someone something that God is teaching you. Paul knew it would encourage him to hear their stories, and it will encourage other people to hear yours. In verse 15, Paul says that he wants to preach the gospel in Rome. Now that likely means, at least in part, he wants to see others in the city come to know Christ. And in verse 14, he says he is obligated or compelled to preach it to the Greeks, to the non-Greeks, to the wise, and to the foolish. Now, Greek was the most commonly spoken language in the world at this time. More people spoke Greek as their first language than any other, even Latin, on earth. And so a non-Greek, so a person who is referred to as a Greek here doesn't necessarily mean they're from Greece or that they're ethnically Greek. It means that they are a Greek speaker as their first language. And the non-Greeks are people who either don't speak Greek at all or don't speak it very well. The wise would be the educated, and the foolish would be the illiterate, the uneducated, which would be a large portion of Roman society. Paul is obligated to share the gospel with all of them. Doesn't leave anybody out. But it also seems he wants to preach the gospel to the church. He says, I want to preach it to you, in verse 15. That might mean he wants them to hear how the gospel is lived, the implications of the gospel, The gospel is not just about our conversion, but also about our sanctification, about our changed life. Perhaps he intends to preach to them the sanctifying power of the gospel. Now we get to verses 16 and 17, and these are sort of a transitional section in the letter. The first word of verse 16 is for, and that ties it back to the previous verses. Paul wants to preach the gospel to those in Rome, for he is not ashamed of it. So these verses belong with the opening section of the letter. But these two verses also belong to the body of the letter, for they are a summary of what Paul is going to lay out in the rest of this letter, what he wants them to know. And these verses are packed with theology. So I'm going to read verses 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Now, Paul has been under attack for years for his preaching of the gospel, and he has suffered for it, but he is not ashamed of it. He refuses to hide what he believes. He does not back down. He does not apologize for it. He celebrates it, and he proclaims it loudly. One commentary said that in the original, this could be translated as it is written here, that he is not ashamed of the gospel. But it could also be translated, the gospel will not put him to shame. In other words, it will not let him down. I watched a series on TV at one time about a celebrity who had belonged to and advocated for a particular religious group that she had been involved in for years. And over the years, she had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in moving further into the teachings of this church by taking courses and so on. And she finally got as far in as one could go, but discovered there was nothing there. It was empty. It did not deliver on its promises. It let her down. It put her to shame because she had advocated for it. She had proclaimed it to be valuable and worthwhile, and it was not. The gospel won't do that. Paul tells us why he's not ashamed of it and why it won't let us down. It's the power of God for salvation. D.L. Moody said, the gospel is like a lion. Just open the cage and get out of the way. In other words, just let it out. Just put it out there and it will do its work because the gospel has power. Paul then goes into the awesome truth that salvation is for all who believe. Now that would have been a huge surprise to a lot of Jews in that day who thought that God had a relationship only with them. The Gentiles were barred from a relationship with God unless they converted first to Judaism. And even then, they were kind of second-class citizens, so to speak. But Paul proclaims it for all who come to Jesus in faith. Since most of us doing this study are not Jewish, it is this profound fact that allows us to have hope and salvation. Paul said that this was through the Jew first and then the Gentile. It's not that the Jews matter more, but that they were first time-wise. And it was through the Jews that God brought his word and his Messiah, his Redeemer, to the earth. We will see further along in the book that the Jews still have a place in the work of God. So how does the gospel bring salvation? Well, verse 17 answers that. It reveals a righteousness that is from God. Now, there are several possibilities of what this righteousness is. The first possibility is that it is the righteousness of God. In other words, his righteous attribute, the holiness and perfection of his character. The problem with that is that doesn't really bring us salvation. It just condemns us. We need more than just to see the holiness and perfection of God's character, because that just shows how far short we fall. We need more than that. We need more than just understanding the perfection of God. The second possibility is that this is the righteousness that is from God. In other words, it's the righteousness that God gifts to us and credits to us through salvation. He gives it to us so we have a right standing with him. And then the third option is that this is the kind of righteousness that is done by God. It has the idea of his active intervention. to right what is wrong and to produce what is right. It involves active, dynamic work on God's part. The righteousness in verse 17 is probably a combination of the second and third. In other words, that God gifts us with righteousness from himself to give us a right standing, and then he actively works to change us and sanctify us and make us righteous. Then in verse 17, it says, this righteousness comes to us by faith from first to last. So there's nothing we can do to earn it or work for it. It cannot be passed on from parent to child. It's only available by personal faith. Faith is somewhat misunderstood in our general culture. Oprah often speaks of you got to have faith. And what she means is you got to have a positive outlook on things. That's not biblical faith. Biblical faith is dependence, full dependence on something or someone else. It's trusting yourself to that in which you have faith. When you get in an airplane, you have faith in the builders of the airplane and the mechanics who maintain it. You are demonstrating faith in the guy who's going to fly it. Even though you didn't overlook the mechanics' work, you didn't check the builders when they built it, and you did not check to see if the pilot is qualified, nor are you watching him fly. You're just getting in your seat, sitting down, buckling up, and trusting that they know what they're doing. Now, it is critical for us, therefore, to put our faith in the right thing or in the right person. If you flew on a subpar airline that did shoddy maintenance work, your faith in their plane might be badly misplaced. And so the object of our faith matters. And in this case, the object is Jesus, and he will not and cannot fail. Think of the important truths we've already learned in these two verses. We do not have to be ashamed of the gospel. It will not let us down. It brings salvation to everyone who believes. It is available to all. It is the means by which we are made righteous. It comes to us by faith alone. We cannot earn it. And it's the plan of God all along, for it was the truth declared in the Old Testament. God is going to lay out this amazing gospel for us in this letter. He wants us to be equipped to live it so that others will not want to miss out on what we have. We hope by the time we are done that we are bold proclaimers of the gospel, for we are not ashamed of it. It will never disappoint or let us down.